this comment I got as soon as this thing connects. Okay, that's it. Right, I'm just going to get straight to the point. Okay, and I might get through some comments at the end, and I'm just going to go through obviously this comment I got, because I thought that the comment was too long and I felt I wasn't getting anywhere with the message. Okay, so this was a comment that I received. It was in one of my videos I did in response on Second Thought. The video that you'll find was Capitalism, not Corporatism, Second Thought Debunked. I think it's one of the most popular videos that I did in response on Second Thought. It seems to be picking up traction, a good number of comments and stuff. And this comment that I just received, yeah, let's just say I received this comment on Second Thought. And so this is what I'm basically going to touch upon, is this particular comment. Okay, so it's a long one, so let's just get straight to it. He says, so you have no solutions, right? This was his way of trying to say it. I've got no solutions, despite the fact I was just stating that capitalism does not exist in the United States today. Yes, maybe in the mixed economy, but not a capitalist system. Continuing on, he says, you simply just don't classify things as capitalism or monopoly. Well, of course I don't, because capitalism's an individualist system. And there is no arguing with the fact that you cannot pull capitalism outside of individualism. You see, a mixed economy is the mixture between capitalism and socialism. It is not a socialist, in terms of a full-blown socialist economy. It is not a capitalist economy. So a mixed economy ends up being corporatist. It's just how it is. It's the mixed economy. Of course, speaking on a whole other subject, a mixed economy cannot escape corporatism. Whole other story. But monopolies owe their origin to that of government's interference. Never in recorded history has a monopoly ever stemmed from predatory pricing. Not a single example. The example of Herbert Dow's chemical company on bromine provides that evidence. Never been an historical example. And so this is exactly what I mean. The reason why there's never been is because the Herbert Dow gave the German cartel a showing up who tried the predatory pricing, and predatory pricing is a very silly idea. It doesn't work. So the only way that you can create a monopoly is basically by restricting productive output. And all of those industries in the late 19th century who were accused of holding monopolies didn't even hold monopolies. It's as simple as that. Their productive output increased. The consumer price index fell. That is not the definition of a monopoly. Ron Chernow, who wrote about that of John Davis and Rockefeller, claimed that he used predatory pricing when he never. The evidence of that is the fact that his consumer prices continuously dropped. The other thing is the fact that he claimed that Rockefeller shafted the consumer, making baseless claims that he drove up prices and shafted the consumer. Again, that didn't happen. So this is the reason why I pointed this out, because I have asked for an example of where a free market, of where the market being free led to the creation of a monopoly. You cannot say that government's interference that creates the problem is the fault of the free market. That's not the fault of the free market, that's the fault of government's interference. I asked for an example of where a monopoly stemmed because of a free market. I get no answer to that. No surprise. He then says, of course, leading on, he says, here's the difference between you and I. I see the problems and want to come up with a solution. You see the problems and just want to talk about definitions and an imaginary, non-existent capitalism that has never existed. Folk, I cannot think of anything more ignorant than this sentence alone. This sentence views the world in black and white. I am not saying that there's ever been something 100%. That's not the real world. It's not the real world of economics. Things are down to a question of scale. You've got classical liberals who support a capitalist system. You've got minarchists who support a capitalist system. You've got anarchists who support a capitalist system. A capitalist economy is typically a market that's strongly free from government's intervention. To the question of scale, who knows? Now, it's not something based on absolutism, as if to say, oh, it has to be exactly this, otherwise it's not a capitalist system. The real world doesn't work like that. That's just plain ignorance. But the reason this is complete and utter ignorance, he says, I see the problems. Well, no, you don't see the problems, because you're defending second thought. If you understood the problems, you would understand that the private sector is the only way that you can rationally finance the economy. If you understood the problems, you would understand that socialism has no benefit to the economy. If you understood what the problems were, you would understand that capitalism's got nothing to do with trying to fix interest rates above or below market value. Now, second thought in his video stated that capitalism was the cause of the boom and bust cycle. I'm not sure if it was that particular video, but in one of them he did. He tried to claim that capitalism was the cause of the boom and bust cycle. What on earth has capitalism got to do with fixing interest rates? You would have to be extremely ignorant to think that's capitalism, and then to turn around and basically say to me, imaginary, non-existent capitalism. Well, excuse me, where was the fixing of the interest rates in the 19th century of the United States of America? Oh, it wasn't there, was it? Exactly, because history contradicts that bullshit. Moving on with what he goes on to say. You and I are idealists. No, there's a strong difference between you and myself. I'm not an idealist, and capitalism is not an idea. Capitalism is a system that pertains to human nature. That's the difference. You're an idealist, I'm not. I've got recorded history on my side, you don't. You see, except I have ideas for how to deal with American suffering, and you just want to bitch about my ideas instead of coming up with your own. Okay, well, here's the problem with this statement. The problem with your statement here is the fact that you're the one idealistic. And the reason why you're idealistic is because recorded history is not on your side. The strongest and most freest economies, such as, for example, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Sweden between 1870 to 1960, and even if you look at a question of scale, when Chile freed up their economy to a certain extent into the 1980s, right up to 2006, it was the fastest growing economy in South America. And each one of the examples of the free market, you could not hold a candle to that in terms of economic efficiency. Not one single mixed economy on this planet Earth could even rival a free market. None. Hong Kong and Singapore have practically no natural resources. They had practically none even in the 1950s. They did not thrive and prosper because of Great Britain. They thrived and prospered because they had strong economic freedom. The freedom to exchange, the freedom to do business, the freedom for prices to regulate freely in the marketplace. That is something that you cannot say for any mixed economy. The best you could throw at me for a mixed economy is probably Norway, or Sweden, or Denmark, which is laughable to say the least given those economies are stagnant. The high GDP per capita coming from Norway came from abusing the North Sea oil for 5 to 6 decades. It did not come from the domestic economy. The whole purpose of the study of economics is to find the most efficient system possible that enables you to translate scarce natural resources into commodities to provide for the market whilst using the fewest resources possible. It's not to tear the backside out of natural resources as if there's no tomorrow and treat it like as if it's an infinite resource, like Norway has basically done to the North Sea oil. So that's not an efficient economy, especially when it's sitting with soaring costs of living in its domestic economy, which is a price signal to tell you there's a severe shortage in their domestic economy, a severe lack of productivity. So how you can sit there and say that I have no real world examples, that I'm just some sort of idealist or something. And you, as you quoted, you said, you and I are idealists. Well, I'm not actually. You said, except I have ideas of how to deal with the American suffering, and you just want to bitch about my ideas instead of coming up with your own. No. What I am telling you, because you came back to me as a critic on my video, you are trying to say that today's United States of America is capitalist when it is not. I distinctly told you, and I even pointed out the evidence. I made it clear that socialism is synonymous to that of collectivism. I even showed you umpteen sources proving that capitalism is antinomous to collectivism, meaning the opposite in meaning of collectivism. I even pointed out to you the definition and definitions of individualism, which defines capitalism, and it clearly defines the free market economy. The individualism defines an economy where the market's left be to regulate itself, free from government intervention. The very fact that your private sector today in the United States of America is overregulated backs my evidence. I made that point abundantly clear, because the United States of America today is more what you call a mixed economy. It is strongly mixed. It is socialism that is strangling capitalism half to death through the strong government regulation over the private sector. That is not the same thing as a capitalist system, and what you're about to go on, and well, in fact, you even said it there, you said before, and I can even show you here, where you said you just want to talk about definitions. Well, of course I want to talk about definitions. That's a bit like taking any word in the English dictionary definitions of words and basically trying to redefine words just because you don't like it. This is something that you lot do a lot of. This is something that you try because you need to. You're trying to redefine capitalism. It's pathetic. And then because I gave you definitions of capitalism and individualism, because you didn't like it, you start going on about how it's all a fantasy, how it's all imaginary. Well, I'm sorry, in real world recorded history, that's far from the case. We've got examples. We've got Singapore to prove it. We've got Hong Kong to prove it. We've even got the 19th century of the United States of America with abundance of evidence to prove it. Now, no one is saying that it was purely free market and there's no absolutisms. I'm not saying that. But what you can do is you can identify parts in the market that were free and left be to identify what was free market, and then contrast that to when government interfered. I illustrated that with the private turnpike industry between 1794 to 1845. I made that abundantly clear. I illustrated the very point that when the market was left be, there was no income tax until 1913. There was no corporate subsidies, which is just another way of saying internal improvements in the private turnpike industry in that specific given time period. It wasn't until Abraham Lincoln stepped in the 1860s with internal improvements, which is just corporate subsidies, that you saw the contrasting difference. The contrasting difference was the free market was efficient. Roads were completed. Roads met the demands of the consumer. The industry was running at a profit, and it had healthy competition. And New York alone built 4,000 miles of turnpike between 1794 to 1820 and had invested $11 million. You think how much $11 million was worth in the first industrial revolution, for crying out loud. If $65,000 was worth a lot of money in 1911 to pay for the damages of the Ash building, what do you think $11 million was worth in those days? $11 million was a lot of money. That was achieved with no income tax. But according to your type, oh, wherever would we be without the income tax? Oh, we wouldn't have any roads. Well, there's an example of the recorded history proving that the free market did something more efficient. Why? Because as soon as your government interfered, the government started building the turnpikes through people's private farmland without their consent. The roads that government were building were unfinished, did not meet the tastes of the consumer, did not meet the demands of the consumer, and it faced eventual bankruptcy. The enormous difference was the free market was efficient, the government was not. That's just a small example. I could go through the hundreds of private companies that faced bankruptcy because of the government subsidies. Why is it that every single time all those private companies who took on government subsidies, why did they all fail and face bankruptcy? Yet the likes of Cornelius Vanderbilt and James J. Hill, who refused to take on government subsidies, why did they far outperform them? They didn't outperform them because they cheated or anything. They done so because they were more efficient. They done so because that's the natural state of what happens when you do not take on government subsidies. You're going to be more efficient. You could see that from the North Pacific Railroad Company, who took on government subsidies. Efficiency did not cross their mind because they were guaranteed a subsidy for every 1 mile of track that they would build. There was no incentive for them to be efficient. Let's move on with, of course, this comment. So yes, you touch upon the definitions, which is just ridiculous. But when you said you and I are idealists, no. Except I have ideas for how to deal with American suffering. Well, no, you don't. Your wonderful government interventionism is responsible for why the cartels exist and thrive. Your wonderful socialist government interventionism is responsible for the very reason why you see an oligopolistic American healthcare market. Your wonderful socialist government interventionism imposed the third-party payer system and created a collusion between private pharmaceutical companies that got away with shafting the consumer, as government was the one responsible for creating a monopoly of cost in the background. So that is a load of nonsense. You are not the solution, because you are agreeing with Second Thought on his socialist idealism. You then said, and you just want to bitch and moan about my ideas. Well, yes, of course I do, because your socialism doesn't work. Instead of coming up with your own, well, actually, I have actually come up with the solution from what I have been educated on. And I owe great debt to the many great economists in the Mises Institute, some of my biggest influences, like Thomas J. DiLorenzo, Tommy Seawoods Jr., and many other greats like Bob Murphy and others like Ralph Raico, etc. And even some that are not even of the Mises Institute, like that of Thomas Sowell or Milton Friedman. Thanks to all of those, great economists, and even Friedrich H. von Hayek, I learned a hell of a lot. So what you're doing is spouting absolute nonsense. As you go on to say, Second Thought is a US channel. Yes, he is. He specifically addresses US issues. What's your point? You then say you don't classify the US as capitalists, so stop complaining about the criticism of the US system. What on earth are you talking about? The whole critique from Second Thought was to blame everything on capitalism. Of course I'm going to interfere on that and refute his silly socialist nonsense. Why would I not? Of course I'm going to do so. Because he's trying to blame capitalism for what is not the fault of capitalism. How the hell can you blame capitalism for the fixing of the interest rates? It's dishonesty. Capitalism is defined by individualism. Individualism means the market regulates itself. It means your interest rates are regulated freely in the marketplace by the laws of supply and demand. It does not mean you step in and start controlling interest rates above or below market value. The market value is capitalism. What is against the market value is anti-capitalism. A donkey could tell you that, but a socialist can't. So how the hell can you blame capitalism? Let's move on with what you basically go on to say following that. You then said just because he classifies it as capitalism like most people in America and the world would, doesn't mean his complaints of this system we live under don't exist. What are you going on about? That is a really ignorant comment. And the reason why that's completely ignorant is simply because of the very fact that he is blaming capitalism. He's leading people up the garden path. Capitalism is the solution to your problem, you buffoon. If you understood economics, if you understood history, you would understand why that is. As I stated, Second Thought was the one who claimed that capitalism caused the boom and bust cycle. The famous saying that, oh, it's all the fault of capitalism. Well, how could it be if it was the socialist fixing of the interest rates? Welcome to the mixed economy. Socialism has to have its presence somewhere. It's not capitalism, because capitalism is the market value. Capitalism is not fixing interest rates above or below market value. Market value is capitalism. If you understood economics, you would understand that fact. So the reality is, what you're basically stating there is utter nonsense. And another thing that I must state here, just because a majority believes something does not make the majority right. If the majority were so right, why the bloody hell is Britain sitting more than £9 trillion in debt? If the majority were so bloody well right, how come Hong Kong has economically embarrassed, humiliated Great Britain? Great Britain's government was extremely limited to what it could do in Hong Kong. Hong Kong sat with extremely low levels of government regulation. That means a market that was strongly free to regulate itself. Hong Kong had practically no natural resources. It could not trade through the border of China. Yet isn't it magical how a tiny small fishing village, once one of the poorest places on planet Earth, yet there it is, it became the richest city in the world at one point. An average household income less than $200 a year. By 1977, with no minimum wage, they managed to drive up over $6,000 plus, then over $16,000 plus. It was getting richer and richer. Each passing decade, the rich grew richer and the poor grew richer faster. Yet despite this fact, you want to sit there and tell me that I'm the fantasist. And of course, mentioning in your statement there of a system that doesn't even exist. Really? So what the bloody hell do you call what Hong Kong and Singapore achieved? They didn't achieve that because of any mixed economy, they achieved it because of free markets. And again, the world is not black and white. It doesn't work like that. It's down to a question of scale, and the word free is even scalable. Some economies are freer than other economies. Again, simple common sense would tell you that. But you've got a linear thought process. You think the term free market means it has to be exactly to a certain given, point in absolutism, because you have a linear thought process. And you think, it's no free market if it doesn't match exactly this. I mean, that is just so overly simplistic of how you view an economy and the world. For example, some parts of the economy are freer than other parts of the economy. Again, I wouldn't expect someone of your lack of intelligence to even comprehend this fact. And you wonder why I respond to you in this manner? After you trying to patronise me with arrogance and ignorance, showing you don't even understand American history. But of course, going on with what you say your definition is less relevant because most people aren't talking about what you're talking about. Really? So if most people talk about communism, that's relevant then, is it? That somehow makes an argument credible. If a lot of people talk about something, that makes it credible, does it? Do you not see how ignorant and downright stupid that argument is? Do you honestly not see how stupid that is? Just because the majority believe in something doesn't make them right. Then you said, but even so, no one is complaining about your imaginary capitalism. No, what they're trying to do is they're trying to label today's economy as capitalism, and what you're doing is being dishonest and calling capitalism imaginary when it is not. There are periods in the 19th century of the United States of America to show that yes, where there was capitalism, the market performed better off. Like, for example, the private turnpike industry left be. Even small bouts as an example. Let's just take, for example, when the market was left be for the ratio of money to be freely regulated. Right? Yet as soon as there was interference and they started fixing the ratio, it ended up distorting the ratio, and it wiped gold out of the market, made silver the dominant standard, and then again they tried to get gold to enter the treasury, this time in 1834. And of course in 1834 they ended up wiping the silver out of the market, and they made gold the dominant standard. Had that been left down to the free market, that problem would never have occurred between gold and silver. It's a prime example of what I'm talking about on a question of scale. The comparison between leaving the market be to that of what happens when you try to control things. That's what you don't understand. And there is umpteen evidence so abundant that every single time that you've seen the interference, you have seen a catastrophic effect. I just take, for example, the trying and testing of paper currency that resulted in the boom and bust cycle of the 19th century. That's what you get for trying to interfere in the market. But of course, we'll just pretend that capitalism was imaginary. Yeah, it was just imaginary that you had a gold standard that the free market determined was your money. It's just imaginary that somehow your interest rates were at one time determined by the laws of supply and demand. Yeah, that was just imaginary. Honestly. Some people are beyond ignorant. Beyond it. Going on. If we lived in a capitalist utopia, fucking ignorance, that Adam Smith believed would exist, no one would be complaining. We don't. So we're talking about the problems and solutions. Unless you have input how to fix things, you're wasting everyone's time. No, what you're doing is you're the one wasting people's time. You're wasting people's time because socialism does not work. If socialism doesn't work, how the hell do you expect it to work inside a mixed economy? And you had the audacity to call me stupid. Someone like you who probably doesn't even have a bloody clue what the economic calculation problem is, you want to call me stupid. You who try to call it imaginary, that there's been bouts of capitalism in the economy. You who are basically trying to oversimplify history. And oversimplify economic history, shall I say. You're the one that basically tries to patronise me and call me stupid. That's a laughing stock. I mean, the stuff that you're saying here, you're basically saying it's all imaginary, and then you ask for problems and solutions. Well, there is real world examples. I gave you one on the ratio of money and what happened when you tried to fix the ratio of money. That was an historical example, vindicating the argument for capitalism, for leaving the ratio of money be. I even gave you an historical example of the private turnpike industry. The difference between what happens when government interferes and leaving it be to the market. I've even given the evidence that what caused the boom and bust cycle was the fixing of the interest rates. What's that got to do with capitalism, which capitalism's to do with the laws of supply and demand determining what your interest rates are? In other words, the market value. That is a solution. But because you're an ignoramus, you just stare past it and said earlier on in what you basically stated, you just want to talk about definitions. Yeah, of course I do. Because talking about the definition of capitalism backs my evidence. Just because you don't understand economic history, it's not my bloody well fault, is it? Of course it's not my bloody well fault. It's your fault. It's your fault for being an ignoramus towards the study of economics and economic history. You know, I try to waken people up. But when it comes to people such as yourself who are so narrow-minded, it's just unreal. Going on with what you basically said into your second paragraph. You said, look, I'm watching the rest of your video and I've noticed a trend. Oh, have you really? You deny real-world impacts and real-world issues. Are you honestly having a laugh? Are you seriously having a laugh? If anything, history vindicates my argument for capitalism. Whether it was the fixing of the ratio, or the fixing of the interest rates, or your failed policy of the fractional reserve banking. No matter where you turn to, and you look at recorded history, your socialist government interference has failed miserably. Here you are sitting under an economy with all of the oligopolies, cartels, and monopolies. But your type claimed that you wanted to protect yourself from all of that. Well, what contradicts you is the fact that not only was it government's regulation, government's interference that led to the creation of all of those things and allowed it to thrive, but it was because of people such as yourself who believed in trying to strongly regulate the private sector to keep it in check, to try and prevent those things. All in the name of government being your great saviour to break up monopolies. Well, how did that turn out for you? Didn't turn out well, did it? Number one, because the robber barons was a myth, and they never were monopolies. Number two, because your antitrust law legislation didn't break up monopolies. In fact, the antitrust law legislation laid the groundwork for monopolies to thrive and prosper, to prop up in the market. AKA, or shall I say, look at, for example, the American Medical Association monopoly that began in 1904. A government-granted monopoly. And the AMA is a cartel. How do you think the cartel came about? Because of government's interference. Cartels do not last in a free market because competition has the incentive to step in and crush it. Because if an industry is profitable, then it attracts competition. That's natural. That's what happens each and every single time. But I don't expect you to even understand that. But of course, you want to sit there and talk about the stuff to do with the real world issues. Well, the real world issues that we see today, your socialist government interventionism has caused nothing but trouble. It's precisely why people have got a high inflationary rate based economy and why we're faced with all of these problems today. It was all your socialist bailouts that caused the bad banks to become too big to fail, that created incompetence. The evidence of the 100% failure rate of the government subsidising private companies in the 19th century where they all went bankrupt is evidence that government subsidies don't work. But of course, don't mind that, eh? You apparently say that I don't have history in my side, or you try to word it in a way that it's somehow imaginary. The arrogance. You then say, you don't understand why change happens, and that as the world changes, expectations change. You don't understand why change happens, and that as the world changes, expectations change. Right. Well, what you don't seem to understand is that just because the world changes, just because a country moves away from a free market, does not make that country right. And it doesn't mean that the reason for why it moved away from the free market is because the free market failed. Wrong. You moved away from capitalism because you have corruption that rules over your country. You thought you would have bloody well seen that evidenced by the rise of the likes of the Federal Reserve, unless you're one of those deluded people who still believes and has faith in the likes of these bankers sitting in the Federal Reserve. You're a laughingstock. I wouldn't even take anybody seriously who trusts the Federal Reserve. Mind you, you had some really stupid people who would turn around and say, oh, but it's a private bank. Yeah, political centralised, which defines socialism, by the way. Defining socialism as political centralisation. A politically centralised central banking system. Moving on. You say you have ideal thoughts on how things are supposed to work, ignoring those ideas in practice. Well, I don't know where you're going with that. The world's most successful economies have all been those that had extremely low levels of government regulation. The history is not on your side. Sweden between 1870 to 1960 had extremely low levels of government regulation. They thrived and prospered, and they became the fourth richest nation per capita GDP in the world. Hong Kong, with practically no natural resources, extremely low levels of government regulation, meaning a strongly self-regulating free market, could not trade through the border of China. A city, or shall I say a tiny small fishing village the size of nothing, that was extremely dirt poor, where the British government was extremely limited to what it could do in Hong Kong, turned towards a free market, and it went on to quickly and rapidly become the richest city in the world by the late 1990s, to overtake the United States and Great Britain. Yet there you are, staring in the face of countries like Norway, Sweden, and Denmark today, under their social market economies, their mixed economies, sitting stagnant in their domestic economies, severe lack of productivity, having wasted vast natural resources in trying to achieve their so-called wealth, which proves their inefficiency, whilst Hong Kong embarrassed them, humiliated them, with practically no natural resources, and grew faster than them. And you want to tell me that I don't have history on my side, that it's just all idealism. You say you have ideal thoughts. Since when was Hong Kong and Singapore an ideal thought? And since when did government ownership of land or government ownership of housing result in a growth of an economy? It doesn't. The growth of an economy stems from your productivity, the freedom to produce. Now, just because you have a high GDP does not mean to say that you're productive in the sense of being efficient. The Soviet Union was being backed and financed by the West. It had a high GDP at one point, but it was overproducing surplus waste. It was overproducing things that the consumers didn't want. It even overproduced, moleskin pelts that were left to rot in warehouses. It overproduced more than 3 pairs of shoes. It created waste. That's the difference between capitalism and socialism. Capitalism wasn't faced with the economic calculation problem, because capitalism was driven by the laws of supply and demand, where the laws of supply and demand determine prices, where prices fluctuate in the marketplace. So you've got the information of profits and losses to run an economy efficiently. It's why Hong Kong was more efficient than any Scandinavian country you could fling at me. So I don't know where you seem to get the idea from that it's somehow idealism. Wow. The ignorance. And then, going on, you say you keep calling the American system socialist, but it's far from socialism as your imaginary capitalism. No, you are misconstruing what I am saying. I am saying that your socialism in this mixed economy today has strangled capitalism half to death and given rise to the corporatist system. That's what I said. You are misinterpreting what I am saying. I am not saying you live under a full-blown socialist economy. I am saying that you can see the presence of your socialism in your economy today. And you can see that through umpteen examples. Your protectionist tariffs. Your socialist government subsidies. Your socialist income tax. Your socialist social security. You could go through umpteen examples of your socialism. All your forced redistribution of wealth. A defining ethic of socialism is coercion. You can see socialism present in this mixed economy. How else do you think you've got your fractional reserve banking? How else do you think you moved away from capitalism's money, which is free market money? Capitalism with regards to money is money that's freely determined by the market through the laws of supply and demand. That was the gold standard. In fact, it was gold and silver. But because of basically interference, you wiped the silver out of the market, made gold the dominant standard, but it doesn't matter. That free market money was gold. So why do you not have gold as your money today? Because it was fraudulently taken and stripped from you. That's not capitalism. It's a mixed economy. It has to be socialism. Socialism has to have its presence. It's the mixture between capitalism and socialism. Capitalism's leaving the market be. Socialism is trying to control it. So are you honestly trying to tell me that socialism is not strongly controlling and directing your economy? A big part of what, and whether you like it or not, a big part of what defines socialism is state direction of the economy. That's the very reason why Nazi Germany was a socialist regime. Because it strongly controlled and directed the private sector through the state. It gave the state the power to completely and collectively control the means of production. A big part of what defines socialism. Yes, in terms of full-blown socialism with regards to the Marxist theory, we acknowledge the fact that it's getting rid of the private sector, but that did not make Hitler any less socialist than what he was. In fact, I'm pretty sure I do have a source there, and I'll leave it for now. I'm just going to move on with, of course, what you go on and say. You say, I honestly thought you were more intelligent than that. Well, if you were that intelligent, you would understand the difference between capitalism and corporatism, but you don't. You say, we are talking about the real world. Well, yes, I'm talking about the real world, something that you certainly don't live in. I mean, you're saying that today's economy is a problem. So if today's economy is a bloody well problem, how is using more socialism a solution to your problem, when socialism is the cause of the problem? Again, moving on, you say we're talking about material conditions. Well, it certainly was nothing to do with socialism for why your material conditions had dramatically improved. Again, let's move on. You're either denying the facts of those conditions or saying that they wouldn't exist. No, I am not denying. I am acknowledging the fact that today's economy is problematic. I've already given you the answer for why the boom and bust cycle happened. A donkey could tell you if you understand basic economics. Now, second thought mentioned about fixing credit below market value. That's not capitalism. If you've got a higher interest rate in the market, it means you've got a shortage of savings. That was the market value. The real market value of interest rates was sky high because there was a shortage of savings. You're supposed to leave the market value be, leave capitalism be. But no, your socialism wouldn't. Your socialism tried to drive down the interest rates during a period when there's a shortage of savings. What did that do? It drove up consumers' demand to go out and borrow and spend more, encouraged investors to go out and borrow and spend more. During a period when there's a shortage, that's what created the boom and then the bust. For you to even dare to even blame that on capitalism when capitalism is about the market value is laughable. Let's move on. As you say, why wouldn't they exist? How can we change it? Well, it's simple. I've already given you the solution to the problem of how you change it. You get government out of the economy. You deregulate the economy. You leave the market be. Stop trying to fix interest rates. Stop trying to fix the ratio. Stop trying to control money. Stop trying to control the economy. Stop imposing the minimum wage. Stop all those controls. That's how you fix the problem. As you say, you need answers, not just idealism. Well, it is not idealism. How the hell is it idealism if history is on my side, proving that the fixing of the ratio caused a problem, proving that the fixing of the interest rates caused a problem, proving that your fractional reserve banking created an inflationary problem? Your paper currency as a solution didn't work. Your idealistic worldview doesn't work because the only rational way you can finance an economy is the private sector. To think you can rationally finance an economy off the back of a printing press is a laughingstock. Again, inflation is the expansion of the paper currency. The more in quantity and circulation, the greater the inflation, and the greater your currency devalues in purchasing power until eventually people drop and lose faith in that currency and you eventually face hyperinflation. So if you want to avoid that problem, avoid socialism. Again, moving on. You say socialists in America have ideals of what we want and policies on how to achieve that system. Look, all you have is nothing other than a laughable attempt at creating your utopian bull. The only place your socialism ends is in totalitarianism. Because first and foremost, you require government taking ownership. And that's what happens in the real world of socialism. And when government takes ownership over things like healthcare and education, etc., etc., the only thing democratic about socialism is voting it into place. You vote it into place, and then eventually when you're faced with the economic calculation problem because of government's price fixing, you end up destroying the information of profits and losses. With no information of profits and losses, there is no possible way for you to possibly have democracy. How can a government possibly know your needs and wants if it's destroyed the information of profits and losses that tells the market what to produce and stop producing, what resources to use and stop using, where to allocate resources and stop allocating, what to invest more and stop investing in, how much to produce, how the resources are transported? How can a government, how can a central planner know that information if it's destroyed the information of profits and losses? It can't. Therefore, it's a load of nonsense to say that the government takes on, the role of just handing it into the hands of the people. That's not how the real world works. Because the government is the one that has to get rid of the private sector in your attempt. And the more and more government takes control, the more problems it creates. Not just by creating a super high inflationary problem through running the printing press, as it wouldn't have the private sector to finance it, but also in order to try and combat the inflationary problem it's faced with in its stupidity, trying to artificially drive prices down below market value, setting price ceilings that create price shortage problems. You see, you don't understand the real world of socialism. The real world of socialism is nothing at all like the idealistic, stupid worldview that you have. And it most certainly doesn't live up to human nature either. You would have thought the Berlin Wall would have taught you a lesson. Do you not understand why the Berlin Wall existed? The Berlin Wall existed because it stopped people from trying to escape for West Germany. If they did not have a Berlin Wall, people would have just left the silly socialist regime. Welcome to the real world of socialism, son. Welcome to the real world of it. Not your idealistic fantasy world. Your idealistic worldview where you can have socialism and liberty at the same time. It's an oxymoron. It's every bit as oxymoronic as the idea of creating democratic socialism. Some democracy, that is, to be faced with the economic calculation problem in the process of government trying to take you on the path of your utopian nonsense. And even then, is the state just going to wither away? No chance. Moving on with, of course, your comment. As you say, you need answers, not idealism. Socialism, as you say, in the free market place of ideas, communism would exist far more than it does because of US and allies' intervention through invasion or covert action in the name of protecting the free market. Mind you, that's just utter nonsense. Complete and utter drivel. That's not the very reason why communism comes around. In fact, even communists in their own words admit that socialism is required, because socialism is the transition between capitalism to communism. Therefore, in the words of communists, in their own words, from the likes of Huberman, I can't remember the other guy's name, but of course they're United States. They own a Marxist magazine. I can't remember if it's Time magazine or whatever it is. But in their magazine, they covered in their own words, and they said you would have to be intellectually dishonest to differentiate socialism from communism, because all socialism is the transitionary stage. That's what they said in their own words. That's coming from Marxists, who said that there's the transitionary stage. Therefore, in order to reach communism, you require socialism. For you to sit there and tell me that it's just a case of, well, you have a capitalist system and voila, bull, because people would not accept the sudden loss of their freedom. George Bernard Shaw acknowledged this fact. That's why George Bernard Shaw, a hardcore socialist, a communist in his own words, of the Fabian Society, a Fabian socialist, the very man responsible for the founding of the Labour Party in 1900 and the very man responsible for the founding of the London School of Economics, George Bernard Shaw, who said that socialism is the same idea as communism, only better English. What exactly was he meaning by that? What he was meaning was the fact that if you feed people communism immediately, they would never accept their sudden loss of freedom. The only way that you can get people to buy into it is gradualism. And if you do enough independent research, you will see who influenced the Fabian Society. They took their influence from Fabius Maximus of the Roman Empire. And that influence stemmed from the very fact that Fabius Maximus would, of course, use political correctness rather than swords to a battlefield. Political correctness worked because it struck fear into the hearts of people, because they feared saying certain things. Well, that's exactly what you're seeing today with the cultural Marxism that you're seeing with all these, Marxists, whether it's Antifa or Black Lives Matter or whoever the hell it is. It's all political correctness. They are basically carrying out exactly what George Bernard Shaw had wished for. And it's through that gradualism, it's through that fear tactics that you transit away from capitalism to communism. In other words, the slow and gradual loss of your freedom. But hey, I don't expect someone such as yourself who hasn't got a clue about history to even know that. As you go on to say, I'm not arguing over utopian view. Well, neither am I, I'm afraid. Whereas you are. You basically are believing in a utopian fantasy world. A utopia where you think you can get rid of the private sector and somehow expect to avoid dictatorship. I mean, you've got to forcibly remove private ownership of property from people. And in order to keep that out of sight, you're going to need a dictator. And it needs a dictator to take you there in the first place, because it requires a strong character, a very, very self-serving character to take you there. Welcome to the real world and practice of socialism. As you said, I'm discussing real life. No, you're not. The real life of your socialism led to tyranny. It led to exactly what you saw in the Soviet Union, and isn't it a surprise that in each and every single one of those socialist regimes, isn't it a bloody well surprise that in every single one of them, when the honeymoon phase came around, which is the first phase, for example, the Soviet Union in the 1930s, every single time the honeymoon phase came along, the socialists would latch onto it and speak and boast of how democratic it was, meanwhile brushing the deaths of countless millions under the carpet like is almost as if it didn't even exist. That to me is what you call psychopathy. There's no two ways about it. That really is. For these sort of people to even dare to place their religious ideology over and above people's own lives that were lost as a result of that, that's psychopathy. That really is mentally ill. That really is. So, For you to even go there is laughable, because in each and every single one of those socialist regimes that were tried and tested, the socialists themselves admitted and conceded that during the honeymoon phase they were boasting of how democratic it was. You saw that more recently with Venezuela. They called it a democratic paradise. That was, of course, until the food shortage and blackouts became very, very widespread. And when those whataboutery and excuses came about in phase 2, and then the silence fell, it was like you could hear a pin dropping, because they ran out of excuses. And then eventually followed the third phase, where they would start going on about, oh, that wasn't the true face of socialism, well, it was never socialist. Contradicting themselves, in other words. By Christ, we've got enough evidence of that, thanks to the great work of Christian Niemiec in his own book, Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies. It's not a book that anybody should read in terms of expecting to learn about why socialism fails, but it's a book that you will certainly learn a lot of quotes to see the true mindset behind these people. They are mentally deranged, and I really mean that. I know that because I've read the book. Really mentally deranged, so much so that Beatrice, I'm sure her name is, who was in the Fabian Society, turned up in North Korea and tried to paint the labour camps as if these were people who in the labour camps, the concentration camps, whatever you want to call them, she tried to paint it as if it had no walls, that it was not like the prisons you have here in Britain or the United States. As if to say it was just a place you would sit in the grass and just think about what you did wrong. That's the truth. That came from her own words. Not right in the head. Mentally deranged. Something mentally unhinged. Screw loose. And yet you socialists justify that. It is truly remarkable, in fact, how much socialism has truly failed. Yet you socialists somehow still support it. Remarkable. It is truly remarkable. There has been no greater failure than that. So, yeah, I mean, where did I... So it was down here somewhere. I do apologise about this, folk. So it was down here somewhere. I'm not arguing with you. It was down here. You can criticise things and say about your generalisation differences in the US that people from the US would understand immediately. This one's truly remarkable, folk. He says, I'm not arguing over a utopian view. I'm discussing real life. You also criticise things that he says about generational differences in the US that people from the US would understand immediately. And you can't because you didn't go to our schools and live in our country growing up with the American dream and American exceptionalism. Let me explain where he's coming from by this sentence here. For goodness sake, it's a stupid mouse. Right. Let me explain to you, folk, where he's basically coming from when he says this, okay? This point here. We'll take it for there. This stemmed from Second Thought's argument complaining about the costs of education to critique capitalism. The attempt to critique capitalism to say, oh, look at our education costs. Now, I don't know why he would do so, because your own education system is run by the state. Is there private education? Yes, it's crowded out. It's much like Britain, it's crowded out, right? Your private education is crowded out, so obviously in the laws of supply and demand it's going to be extortionate. But you have a state education system, right? Now, forget that point, however. Second thought was basically trying to blame capitalism for the expensive costs of education, and this is where this is coming from. He is saying to me that I cannot be in the country, so therefore, since I've never been in the country, I cannot pass comment. Well, yes, I can. It's called understanding basic economics. It's called understanding the laws of supply and demand. It's called understanding that private ownership has 0% F all to do with cost. It's not because it's privately run. It's not even truly privately run, but it's not because there's a private sector. That's not the reason for why it's expensive. It's expensive because of the laws of supply and demand. You restrict the supply and you increase the demand. That's the very reason why it's expensive. And who's responsible for that problem? The government. And there are several other reasons that people could touch upon. It's not the fault of capitalism. That was the point. So yes, even although I've never been to the United States of America, I wouldn't need to be. I wouldn't require going through your educational system or understanding your American dream in order to understand basic economics. So it's a fallacious argument. What the hell is that supposed to mean? That's like saying, people cannot talk about the Industrial Revolution because they weren't born then. I mean, the stupidity of that argument is just... wow. Right. He then goes on, you don't know about the constant barrage of anti-leftist propaganda. I'm not sure about the anti-leftist propaganda. There probably is anti-leftist propaganda to some extent. But given the evidence that we see from the education system, just look at how many Marxists are coming out of all these universities and all of these, state-run schools, etc. You can see that by the evidence of how many, people are falling for bloody well socialism in the United States. I think that's bloody well obvious. He then says everything that has happened in America impacts how Americans think and approach things. I don't claim to know about Scotland to dismiss Scottish thoughts, because I've never lived in Scotland or grown up there. What's that got to do with the price of cheese? You don't need to live in Scotland in order to understand economics. If you understand economics, you understand economics. You wouldn't need to be in a country to basically... You don't need to be in the United States of America. I've never been in the United States of America, and besides the point, despite me having never been there, I know more about your history than you do. What's your name again? Aaron Kempster. I know more about your country than you do. That's how pathetic it is, okay? Right? That's honestly how pathetic it is. I know more about your history than you do. Yeah? You're probably the type of person who believes in the myth of the robber barons. You're probably the type of person who believes in the New Deal myth. The myth that FDR saved you from the Great Depression. You're probably the type of person so pathetic you probably think... You probably think that the antitrust law legislation saved you from monopolies. I can even go as far as to tell you something in American history that you probably didn't even know about. Because I'm Scottish. And your country is rancid. And I mean rancid. Absolutely rancid with Scottish history. Your country is so deep with Scottish history that you could practically say you're United Scotland of America. That's how I grew such a passion and interest. I know a lot about your country because a lot of my people had settled there. I've got admiration, a love and a respect for the American people, especially the patriotic American people who stand by the values and fight for exactly what my own people had fought for when they went there to what would become the United States of America. And that piece of history that I can give to you that you probably didn't even know about in your own country is about Andrew Jackson. That his mother was Scottish, and one day his mother scalped him across the ear and shouted, "Stop crying." And he looked up to his mum and he said, "But why, Mum?" And he's crying. And Andrew Jackson, his mother had responded to him, "Only girls were made for crying," she shouted at him. And Andrew Jackson had responded to his mother, "So what were boys made for, mother?" And his mother responded, "Fighting." In other words, the Scottish influence on Andrew Jackson had led him to spend his entire days fighting to his last dying breath, where he said in his famous words that he killed the banks, or the Second National Bank, or whatever it was. I bet you didn't even know that about your own history. So, your patronising tone is laughable. Let's move on with your utter nonsense. I mean, you're trying to say that I need to be in your country. I need to, live the experience of your education system in order for me to understand about your country. I mean, I honestly cannot think of something more idiotic than that. That's like saying, well, you didn't live in the Industrial Revolution, so you can't talk about it. Okay then, so nobody can talk about the Roman Empire then? Fuck's sake. Let's just go on to this. In fact, I think I missed an important point. Because he does go on. He says, basically, wherever your view is in the system, it is coming from a place of ignorance and idealism. My views are coming from ignorance and idealism. You really do share the red flag traits of a narcissist. You honestly do, because it's projectionism. It's gaslighting. It's basically you yourself are the one that's ignorant. You yourself are the one that's idealistic. You're the one who doesn't have history on your side, but you're projecting that off onto me and trying to make me out as if I'm the one who is just that. I'm not going to go as far as to call you a narcissist, because it doesn't necessarily mean to say that you are a narcissist. But as you're going to say, unless you have real world solutions besides reclassifying, then there's no need to talk to you or listen to you. Now that's real, that's arrogance right there. That's conceited. That's the kind of, oh, I'm too good to talk to you now. If you haven't got such and such, I'm too good to talk to you. Pompous fool. You are the type of people like you are the type of people the Scottish people despise. And the reason why Scottish people in our nature don't like your type is because we're a very honest people, and we're a very honest and outspoken people. A people who don't like the sort of people who are fake. So when it comes to people as pompous as yourself and as fake as yourself, you'll notice one thing about us Scots. We're not scared to tell you like it is, and we're not scared to show our actual real emotions. We don't put on some fake, face to, hide our emotions. We're real, and people get that from us. And yeah, I mean, when it comes to people like you, you're pathetic. You're the sort of person who thinks you're something special. Pfft, laughable. Then you go on, but for your own sanity, just replace every time second thought says capitalism with corporatism and enjoy the content. Well, I'm afraid not. How can I? How can I enjoy the content when he has more than 1 million subscribers, gets thousands and thousands of likes, for second thought turning around and saying that capitalism is the cause of the problem, that the private sector is the cause of the problem? How can I turn a blind eye to someone who says capitalism caused the boom and bust cycle? That's dishonesty, it's misinformation, and it's leading people up the garden path to the wrong information. The solution is capitalism. So yes, I have every right to correct what you're basically stating. And now, on to this. And I'll try and go through this quicker. I don't even want to get into this with you, but when it comes to the whole thing, the transportation infrastructure, you need it to be able to exist. What is he going on about? So is he trying to say that you need the public sector in order for transportation to exist? Well, look what Chile did. Chile privatised their transportation, and their transportation thrived. Again, we can look at the historical example of what happened under British Rail because of nationalisation, with the outdated trains, etc., running at nearly a £1 billion deficit, but hey, how great was nationalisation? A British rail industry that was going bankrupt, and there was endless strikes because of the inflationary problems. That's right, socialism in practice. That's right, Scotland lived the experience. That's right, Scotland had heavy nationalisation. That's right, Britain was living under the most heavily nationalised economy outside the communist world. And by Christ, did it destroy the British economy. So much so that we became known as the sick man of Europe by 1974. Faced the inflationary problems. And as a result of the inflationary problems, they tried to fix prices below market value and created a shortage at the pump in 1974, and then led us to the winter of discontent in 1978, only then, thankfully, for Margaret Thatcher to save our economy from the disastrous communist pish that was called democratic socialism. That's right, your prolonged testing of democratic socialism, as Margaret Thatcher quoted saying, was a miserable failure in every respect, as Margaret Thatcher quoted saying. And by Christ, was she right in what she stated. Your democratic socialism ticked off at least 7 out of 10 of the Communist Manifesto planks, leading us right on the road towards communism. Even Arthur Scargill had close ties to the Soviet Union, for crying out loud. But hey, it's not communism, it's democratic socialism. It's like taking a jobby and sprinkling hundreds and thousands on it and saying, look, it's not a jobby. It's got hundreds and thousands on it. Socialism really is like a jobby, a big jobby in the toilet that just won't flush away. That honestly is the history of socialism. So, as goes on to say, if a pandemic wiped out airlines, then we wouldn't have transportation in this country. Load of utter nonsense. Utter crap. What's he trying to say? The free market wouldn't have transportation, etc. is just utter shit. If anything, it's through his price controls and all sorts that would create such a problem. As he says, so in some way it needs to be subsidised. It needs to be subsidised. Well, your subsidies resulted in such failure in the private sector and led to bankruptcy. So you're talking shit. The only reason why you're seeing it today is because of the inflationary problems. Yes, under a capitalist system, certain private companies in the transport industry would go bankrupt. That's what you're supposed to do. That way only the best survive. Therefore the best company survives. So who do you think benefits from that? The consumer. I mean, this is common sense. This shows you don't even understand how a market operates. As you say, it needs to be regulated because they can charge whatever they want for you to fly, especially if there's a natural disaster. Again, this is just complete and utter nonsense. It's not down to them. They're not the ones that can charge whatever the hell they like. They charge based on what the consumer determines. That's what they charge on. And if it's a free market, you've got fierce competition. So again, that's utter nonsense. You don't have a free market. That's what part of the problem is. You've got an oligopolistic system, a monopolistic system. That's why there's the problem in the British rail industry today. That's because the government's heavily involved. So you're talking crap. As you say, that brings me to idealistic demand. Nonsense. As you said, healthcare does not fall into the rules of capitalism. What are you? Just stop talking crap. Just stop talking crap. Stop utter nonsense. I mean, where do you get such bullshit from? Where do you get that crap from? Today in the United States of America, they have two healthcare systems. One is based off the capitalist model, the other is the anti-capitalist model. Thanks to your socialism, it drove American healthcare costs through the roof. Isn't it funny how the more free market model based direct primary care system is more than 80 to 90% cheaper than the main American healthcare market? Do you want to know how that happened? Because the free market removed the third party payer system. The free market model, that is. That's not to say you've got a free market economy, but the direct primary care model, the more free market based model, removed the third party payer system, so there's no middleman. Therefore it's a straight transaction between the consumer and provider. So the consumer is now king. Second thing, they removed 80% of the health insurance. So they dramatically reduced Americans' healthcare costs. So you're talking shit. You're literally just making things up as you go along because you don't have a clue what you're talking about. Then he says, because you... Here it comes. Because you would pay anything for needed surgery because that or dying. Again, complete and utter drivel. Complete and utter drivel. You're basing this off of today's main American healthcare market. And you're trying to say that healthcare is inelastic. Bullshit. How do I know that is bullshit? Because the NHS, when it first came to fruition, when it was nationalised in 1948, the NHS was faced with a problem. The demand soared out of control because those who were otherwise not seeking treatment beforehand, because of the so-called free at the point of use, demand soared out of control. Why else do you think you ended up with the long waiting lines where thousands of cancer patients die every single year needlessly because of the neglect? That's just cancer patients. We're not even talking about those with heart disease or anybody else with all the other problems. In 2014 alone, more than 60,000 people died needlessly because of the neglect of the NHS. But apparently, and according to your socialist propaganda, it's available for everyone. 60,000 people died. in 1 year. That's the size of a bloody football stadium because of that. Needlessly died. Thousands every single year, but it's available for everyone. You're talking crap. As you say, people will always need a house. What's that? What the hell is that supposed to mean? Are you trying to blame today's housing market with the cost of living on capitalism? I don't know where you're going with this. But minus a few aspects, the housing market can exist. But we have more houses that are vacant than homeless people. So we clearly need more public housing. You see, here's the problem with this silly, stupid argument. Not only did Britain have where a third of British housing was all council housing, and by the way, it was a dump. The council housing were a complete dive, because there's no incentive to look after it, because it's not them that's paying for it, right? They're not the ones paying for it, so there's no incentive for them to look after it, because there's no risk and reward involved. Where's the risk and risk involved in the whole thing? There is no risk involved. And the reason why there's no risk is because they're not the ones having to work to pay for the things. They're not the ones having to work to pay for the damages. And collectively on society, that damages, and it costs a hell of a lot more. It drives up your cost of living. How else do you think you're going to pay for it? It's not more affordable anyway. And the quality deteriorates. Forget that point, however. The truly magical part is you're talking about homeless people and all the vacant houses. Housing isn't free. This is the problem you don't understand. Because the complexity of the housing market is that no two houses are the same, and every location is different. Some people prefer living in the main city, and then even you can break things down within a city. Some people like living in a specific part of the city, so demand is different in every part of the market. Since you're so simple-minded, you're so, you literally live in a deluded fantasy world where you think all housing is the same, and you don't even take into account that locations are all different from one another. So let's just use, for argument's sake, there's a scarcity of housing. There's people who want to live in the beachfront. There's people who want to live in the countryside. There's people who want to live in the city. But do two people wish to live in the same type of housing? Have you ever watched those type of housing programs where people go and they're looking to buy a house and they check out the first house and they go around and they kind of, leave it for a second, and then they go to another house and then another house, and then at the end of it all they judge what house they like better, what suits them. The point being, it's not the same, because housing isn't all the same, because you require, some houses are more specifically designed for better use for families. You might have 3-bedroom houses, or you might have the type of house that was probably more suited to an elderly person. So housing isn't just something fixed, and scarcity is an economic reality. You can't then just take price and just do away with it, because then if you do away with price, how then do you get to determine who gets to live in what? Because the only other way that you can do that is through favouritism. If there's a high demand of people seeking to live in the beachfront, how then, without prices, do you get to determine who gets to live in them? Now, I'm not saying that people who are homeless should not be helped, and that they shouldn't get shelter, and they shouldn't get help in order to lift themselves up off the streets. And it's actually the free market that, improves their life, gives them opportunity, get them out of that mess. But you think it's just a case of just guaranteeing a house? And who pays for that? Again, you don't even know where the money comes from. Jesus. Going on. And better mental health programs. Yeah, that worked ever so well. Just look at your wonderful welfare state. That worked so well, didn't it? It bloody demoralised them. It made them feel like a piece of shit. As you go on to say, keep in mind that Adam Smith himself argued that a free market society would have enough excess wealth to take care of poor and build hospitals, so the perfect capitalist system cannot exist. Again, this is just utter garbage, right? It really is utter garbage. I mean, just because you take it from Adam Smith, what about someone 100 years after that? What about someone like Ludwig von Mises? Huh? Or you don't want to touch upon Ludwig von Mises? Why is that? Is that because it contradicts your narrative? And no one said everything's black and white. So again, it's just a silly argument. Envisioned with the current views of social Darwinism. I really don't know where you're going with that one. Then we talk about food. Some concept. There needs to be food. And it needs to be affordable. Yeah, well, the thing is the fact that, again, you can't ignore the laws of supply and demand. You can't ignore scarcity. You can't just do away with prices and treat food as if it's infinite. And there's the very problem, because it's prices that enable your food to reach the shelves to begin with. Now, your centralised agriculture resulted in starvation, so it's rather quite convenient that you would touch upon food. And the only way that you're ever going to allocate food efficiently is through a profit and loss system determined by a free market. So you're shooting yourself in the foot. And what creates more affordable food? Again, in the laws of supply and demand. Leave the market be to be more productive. Again, as you say, keeping those businesses alive through government subsidies. You really are ignorant. Your government subsidies make the poor poorer. You tax people in order to subsidise. You're making the taxpayer poorer. You have to tax them more in order to subsidise. And where does the subsidising end? All your subsidising does is it encourages failure. It encourages inefficiency. And the reason why it encourages inefficiency is because you're guaranteeing money in the pockets of those who were incompetent to begin with. Would you give a dog a doggy biscuit for behaving poorly? No, you wouldn't. So why the hell would you give a business that's incompetent in running business? Why then would you reward that? Don't ever call me stupid again. A donkey could tell you you leave inefficiency to fail so it can learn from its lesson, and you allow newer, more efficient industry to come through. That way the consumer benefits. That's how you get cheaper costs of goods and services, through competition. You don't get it through subsidising failure. How else do you think your banking crisis happened? It was caused by all the bailing out of the banks. It's sometimes necessary. No, it's not. And regulation is necessary. Really? If it's so bloody well necessary, why is the most successful economies those which are strongly left to freely regulate themselves? If it was so bloody well necessary, why was it when your OHSA stepped in, the Occupation for Health and Safety Administration, a government regulatory body over safety in the workplace, why was it for more than 100 years the death toll in the American workplace was declining, and of course the workplace injuries was declining up until 1970. In 1970, the OHSA got involved. As soon as the Occupation for Health and Safety Administration got involved, your workplace injuries has been stagnant ever since. So according to you, and judging by your logic, your government regulation would have helped the issue. But did it? No, it never. So you're being contradicted by real world history. How convenient. Given the fact that you, of course, were the one who was talking about, I'm the one who's idealistic. Otherwise, you can get it into a situation of famine and widespread starvation if anything goes wrong. Utter shite. In fact, if anything, the funny thing is that your government subsidies has resulted in a serious problem within Africa that's causing starvation. Because you're hindering productivity. There are aspects of the modern world, especially with how codependent we all are for survival, to have certain systems that can operate with or without private sector success. Your ignorance of private ownership is astounding. Your ignorance is just beyond belief. Had it not been for private ownership, you would not have killed off the periodical famines that the world had faced. Why else do you think when they centralised agriculture, millions died of starvation in the Great Leap Forward? Your ignorance of history is astounding. Do you not understand the tragedy of the commons? It was caused by your communal ownership. That's right, feudalism was akin to communism. Oh yes, it was. It was centrally planned, top down. Central planning defined socialism. It was communal ownership of property. It was communal ownership of land. There was no freedom for the individual to work for the fruits of their own labour. That was the primary reason for their starvation. In other words, what caused their starvation was the absence of secure private property rights. You really don't understand your own history, do you? You don't know about Jamestown in 1607, do you? What happened in Jamestown in 1607? Well, 103... I'm sure it was about 103 pilgrim settlers settled into Jamestown in North America, what would become, of course, the United States, in the Virginia Tidewater region. It was a triangular settlement that was surrounded by a large quantity of seafood surrounding them, with deer and turkey to fetch for, and fertile soil. And lo and behold, despite the fact having all that cornucopia of seafood surrounding them, or a large quantity of it, despite the fact they had a large quantity of seafood surrounding them that they could fetch for, and deer and turkey, and of course fertile soil to grow their own food, within the space of 6 months, all but 38 of them had died due to starvation and disease. Britain, of course, sent across another 500 pilgrims 2 years later. 500 pilgrims resettled into Jamestown. What happened? 440 of them died due to starvation and disease. The same repeat within 6 months. Sir Thomas Dale was sent across to identify the problem, and he identified the problem as the free rider problem. It was caused because of communal ownership of property. That's right, socialism. It was caused because they didn't have the ability to work for the fruits of their own labour, which is historical proof, historical evidence that communal ownership of property has nothing to do with individual ownership. So if you ever hear a libertarian socialist, an oxymoron, talking about personal ownership of possessions, just tell them to shut up. Seriously, just tell them to shut up. Because they don't understand history. I mean, it really is a laughing stock that you would even go on about all this crap about the whole thing to do with, you know, the private sector and stuff like this. And I even spoke about it before. You're not guaranteed success in the private company, for goodness sake. And then you speak about and regulations need to be in place. Bullshit. For example, in the next couple of decades, water will become very scarce. Well, if water becomes scarce, then of course you do not put the government in charge of it. Milton Friedman took the utter piss out of socialists by saying that if you put the government in charge of the Sahara Desert, it would run dry, which is quite funny because it's the truth. It's the truth because you don't understand that without the information of prices, without the information of profits and losses, you've got no way of allocating resources efficiently. And time again, we have saw what governments have created. In fact, funny enough, when you talk about a water shortage, there was the Aral Sea, once the 4th largest lake in the world. It sat between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. Once the 4th largest lake in the world. And isn't it funny? Isn't it funny that as soon as the Soviet Union redirected the rivers that fed the Aral Sea, all in the name of an agricultural policy, the Aral Sea ran dry. They started that in 1920, and by 1960, there was nothing left of it. The land was left contaminated. The local fishing industry between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan was devastated. That is a prime example of socialism in practice. And you cannot have socialism without central planning. You can't. It's impossible. I will never, ever, ever take a libertarian socialist seriously because there's nothing libertarian about them. They cannot avoid totalitarianism. Hell, even within their so-called Capitol Hill autonomous zone, they were bloody well forming their own form of government that rapidly within 2 weeks. That's how much of a joke they are. And these were the sort of people who you could tell were basement dwellers, who couldn't even understand simple common sense that farming is not something that's done over days. Farming is something that's done over months and over a year. It's done over yearly processes of planting and waiting for things to grow. These nutcases were expecting things to grow like in days. I mean, that is honestly how this is honestly what you're up against. So, for a socialist to call me stupid is laughable. People will pay anything. This is magical. People will pay anything for water, and you need a lot of it to survive. This isn't how the real world works, okay? In fact, I can tell you this, if it was privately owned, right? The person who privately owns something seeks to make a profit. So if someone owns something privately, how do they make a profit? They have to appreciate the value of the land. They're faced with the economic reality that land can either appreciate in value or depreciate in value. Since when was it profitable to a capitalist, a landowner, to have their land depreciate in value? Are you out of your mind? If a capitalist wants to make a profit on land and they cut down all the trees, they're going to regrow the trees, aren't they? Of course they are, because they want to appreciate the value of their land. It reminds me of that argument of the negative externalities, as if they say, oh well, we can just take toxic waste and just dump it in the river. Yeah, very good. How's that going to benefit him? It's just going to depreciate the value of his land, of his property. So he's not going to. And even if he done so and it carried downstream to another private landowner, that other private landowner can take that person to court and fine his arse. Welcome to the real world of private property rights. Welcome to the real world of secure private property rights. Welcome to the world of Mr. Pinkerton, his name is? Pink, or I can't even remember that economist's name. Claims to support capitalism. A mixed economy sympathiser. He's got grey hair or something. I can't remember his name. He's long grey hair. He was on the Joe Rogan show. And he said that capitalism can't deal with negative externalities. Doesn't even understand bloody secure private property rights, and he's saying that. And these are the people that's the type of people that people listen to. It's the usual myths that come out about capitalism. It really is. So he's going on about here, about the water and stuff like that. We need systems and regulation places to keep it affordable. You fool. Let me translate what you just said there. We need systems and regulations in place to keep it affordable. Do you know what that's saying? You are saying there that you want price controls. And in order for you to keep it affordable, you need to set down price ceilings. And what do price ceilings result in? A price shortage problem. That's right. You end up creating the very problems that you do throughout recorded history, time and time again, whether it was the blackout in New York City in 2003 of August 24th, or whether it was the blackouts in Venezuela, or the food shortage in Venezuela, or of course the surplus waste of oranges in California, or even, the price ceilings of what you saw. Of course, I mentioned some of them being price floors, but you get my point. It's this idea they think they can control prices above or below market value, and somehow nothing will go wrong. Keynesians and Marxists, they are utterly clueless about prices, folk. They honestly don't know the first thing about prices. They haven't got a clue. They don't understand. They just don't get it for the life of them. This is the reason why you see these problems time and time again. Even when it came to the housing shortage crisis during the Second World War in the United States of America, what did they try to do to try and make housing more affordable? More affordable? We'll do a Jeremy Corbyn, and what we'll do is we'll set down rent controls. Folk, do you know what rent controls do? Rent controls benefit the rich. They benefit the likes of Jeremy Corbyn. And do you know what rent controls cause? They not only cause a shortage problem because singular persons over-occupy the housing that's there, meaning that families seeking to find a house can no longer find a house because people have over-occupied them, because people who were otherwise living with their parents have now went and bought into these cheap flats or whatever, and have over-occupied the rented apartments, etc, etc. So there becomes a price shortage problem, right? Do you know what happens? Those people who are living in those for several decades, the quality deterioration takes place. Do you want to know why that happens? Because the property owner the one who rents out the property, right? They leave. They're not going to stick around to run at a loss. Why would they? Why would they stick around to run at a loss? They're not going to. So they leave because they don't want to face the brunt and get the blame for it. So they leave, right? Because after all, government would hold them responsible. So of course they end up packing up and they leave. And that leaves that those people living in that property for several decades, the quality deteriorates so much so that the housing ends up getting boarded up. And what happens to those people? They end up homeless and die on the streets because of a price control, because of rent controls, because of my good intentions. It's all about my good intentions. Because my feelings matter more than your economic reality. This is the person who called me stupid. So, as he says, some systems either can't work under pure capitalism. I don't know where he's going with this crap. He's honestly just talking utter crap. It's the same thing we spoke about healthcare. Or need safety nets. Well, no, not really, because they're charitable operations in a free market. Anyway, so we don't all die. So we don't... here comes this crap again. So we don't all die. You've got to laugh at that. More than 60,000 people died because of the neglect of the NHS in 2014 alone. Right? More than 60,000. Never let alone all the homeless people who die because of his wonderful mixed economy. Right? In other words, more people die per year in the mixed economy than a free market economy ever would. Right? And he wants to tell you that, oh, it's so that people just don't die. It's so they don't die. What do you call your socialism that drove American healthcare costs through the roof then, eh? Your American socialist third-party payer system of monopolising the cost in the background, causing private pharmaceutical companies to get away with shafting the consumer through a collusion caused by government monopolising the cost in the background. Huh? Oh, that was wonderful, that was, wasn't it? That really saved people's life, didn't it? What about the tens of thousands of people's lives that could be potentially saved through life-saving drugs that your Food and Drug Administration prevented people from gaining access to? Oh, that's right, you didn't touch upon that one, did you? No, that's right, we won't go there, because that contradicts the narrative. Another example is what's happening in Texas. Yeah, what's happening in Texas? What happened in Texas? Oh, that's right. What happened in Texas was the federal government has prevented, in the name of climate change, the Green New Deal, climate change, it basically prevented Texas from upping their energy use. In a case of an emergency. And since Texans have to seek permission from their federal government, they've been left in blackouts. Oh dear, that was caused by the federal government. Looks like you just stuck your foot right in the shit. You think I don't understand what I'm talking about? Yet again, government creates a problem, capitalism gets the blame. It's tiresome. The energy all went out. They are not connected to any interconnected power grids. You know, it was the same story, folk. I remember the time, and Thomas Sowell touched upon this. If you remember the blackout in New York in August 24th, 2003, they tried to claim it was the deregulation of the power grid. And the reality was the power grid was over-regulated. The real cause of the problem was a price ceiling. But there you go. This is the economic illiteracy. They end up because he's already conceded above. He's already stated above about the price. He wants to set down price controls, which is him in translation saying we need to make things more affordable. So he's basically saying let's set down price ceilings. Do you know what that's going to cause? Blackouts. It's going to create exactly what you saw in August 24th, 2003 in New York. You see, that's the difference between people like me, who understand what I'm talking about, to these people who have all these good intentions, and their good intentions are faced with dire consequences in economic reality. I'm sorry for this video being so long, folk, but this has to be done. Because this comment is just unacceptable. The patronising tone that I got from it as well is just ridiculous. They need government assistance. Without taxes, how do you suppose that we help them? That reminds me of if we don't have any taxes, where's all the roads going to come from? Oh, my roads. If there's no taxation, where's my roads going to come from? Well, where do you think it comes from? It comes from the free market and private companies providing a service. And the funny thing is, we've got the real world history, the historical example between 1794 to 1845, the private turnpike industry, where New York built 4,000 miles of road of turnpike between 1794 to 1820. And had $11 million worth invested into it. $11 million worth in the first industrial revolution. Think about that. 11 million. No income tax. No internal improvements in that period of the turnpike industry. The internal improvements, which is corporate subsidies, did not come around until Abraham Lincoln. A real world historical example contradicting the nonsense, but he was the one who says, I'm all about idealism. Also, you ignore that in the US, 50 cents on every tax dollar funds our military. If everyone gave 10% flat tax, it would destroy our current military. So how do you suppose we do that? Not necessarily. That isn't necessarily the case. I mean, if someone wants a flat tax rate of 10%, and they wish to use that for such things as, maybe military. In other words, limiting government's role purely down to military, then that's what they would finance it for. And the difference is the money's going directly straight to the, to the military. It's not a case that you're, paying for healthcare, education, because government's no longer in control of all of that. Plus the fact you have to also think about the quantity of money that people would be earning. People would have more money in their pockets. There'd be a much wealthier society, a low inflationary rate based economy as well. So when you're talking about people paying a lot of money, then yes, that is still a lot of funding going to government that would then pay for military if that's the case. So I don't know where he's going with that argument. That's if people do believe in that as such. He says there are many realities you seem to be ignoring. No, not really. It's actually yourself that's ignoring the realities. You also realise that we support more government and more government oversight and regulation. Yes, you do, and that has created the very crisis that you're in today. In fact, As a result of over-regulating the private sector, you have driven private sector costs through the roof. A donkey could have told you that, but you still can't latch onto that. The funny thing is, the mascot, is it, of the Democrats, or I like to call them the Dumbocrats, is a donkey. and then he says, we want the government more more accountable. How the hell can you increase the size of government, become more dependent upon the government, and then have it become more accountable? You don't make logical sense. Because the system today is completely undemocratic. Well, obviously, you are responsible for that. You created the big government. You created the nanny state. It was you who created the dependency upon the state. You're the one who is responsible for all the social security and welfare statism and taxing the people half to death, all in the name of paying for your wonderful socialist nonsense. That's what created the dependency upon the state. That's why it became so undemocratic. And besides, the United States isn't a democracy. It's a constitutional republic. We also want the government, if they are going to bail out needed industries, here we go, that exactly what caused the banking crisis. Incompetence creates a problem. So what do? You bail out incompetence only for incompetence to become more incompetent, because incompetence is now rewarded for its incompetence. Just like the bad banks. The bad banks got away with legally protected fraud, which is another way of saying it was being rewarded for its fraud. It was being protected by government, forcing the taxpayer to continuously protect them on their fraud, on their losses. So all of the losses that they made, the taxpayer of society wrongly was forced to pay for it, and all of the gains that they made, they got to keep. The difference was the morally bankrupt and corrupt bad banks, they didn't face risk because the risk was taken away from them. And if you have not got risk involved, you're no longer concerned with efficiency. So basically you're just saying that we should prop inefficiency up and just encourage more inefficiency. Meanwhile, forcing taxpayers to become poorer and poorer and poorer, bailing out more and more and more industry. Bailing out through what? The printing press? Because after all, you're the one insinuating getting rid of the private sector. Oh my God, man. And he says to have oversight committees and oversight committees. they think it's just a case of, having these, godly figures. Basically, another word for committees in their language is just basically another government, right? It's these overseers. The overseers are going to regulate the regulators. And then who's going to regulate the regulators of the regulators or something? They really are a laughingstock. Ensuring that they are using their bailout correctly. What are you talking about? The main problem with bailouts is you're encouraging incompetency. That's the problem with bailouts. Because you're guaranteeing money in their pocket. They didn't have to work for it. So efficiency goes out the window. That was the main reason why the North Pacific Railroad Company was such a disastrous failure. Because all it was concerned with was not its neighbours. It didn't care about its neighbours. It was just going to build two railroads through the West, not caring about the neighbours. Why? Why would it care about its neighbours? If it's guaranteed, a large sum of money for every 1 mile of track it's going to build. It's not going to be. It's not even going to care about the materials it used. It's not even going to care about the length of time it takes to build it. So efficiency goes out the window. They don't care about it. Why would they care about it? They're being guaranteed a $45,000 subsidy for every 1 mile of track that they build. In fact, they were even being, rewarded for building uphill, for building up mountain. They were being rewarded for that type of stuff, so they would get more money for it. So what happened was, the North Pacific Railroad Company ended up building it over, I think, thin ice or something like that. I can't remember specifically the details. They ended up building it poorly because they used poor quality materials. They ended up taking a longer route, so it actually cost them more to build it, and they didn't care about their neighbours. See, by the time they finished building it, they couldn't open it. Damages occurred. And guess what? The company faced bankruptcy in 1873. And guess who stepped in and gave them a showing up? The market entrepreneur James J. Hill, who basically took the only successful railroad in American history, known as the Great Northern Railroad. He built it with better quality materials. He even encouraged the neighbours around him that if you build your farms around me, around my railroad, I will give you grain and wheat in return. I'm pretty sure that's what he gave in return. But he basically rewarded them for building their farms around, his railroad. So he was rewarding the neighbours. Not only was he rewarding the neighbours and, of course, using better quality materials, he was able to do the job quicker, far cheaper, and took a quicker route. He built it through the Rockies, the famous Rockies, the tunnel. That's what James J. Hill did, the market entrepreneur in the absence of subsidies. Meanwhile, the hundreds of other railroad companies all faced bankruptcy because of government subsidies. And he wants to tell you, this one who called me stupid, by the way, wants to tell you that somehow encouraging failure, encouraging incompetency. It says, it's no different to having a dog, it behaves poorly, and then rewarding it with a doggy biscuit for every time it behaves poorly. So it goes out and bites someone, here's a doggy biscuit. That's exactly what he's saying. You also had multiple points that contradicted each other because you responded line by line instead of taking the whole point at one time. It's okay, you can just do a condescending laugh and act like that's an argument because other libertarians will laugh along and you'll all think you did something special. No, what I did was I made a fool out of you and you ignored my argument. What did I say to you? I said to you that the main American healthcare market is in the position it's in today because of your government interference that enabled the cartel to thrive and prosper, known as the American Medical Association. It was the government that granted the monopoly to them in 1904 that allowed them to close down all those medical schools. It was thanks to you and all your wonderful socialist government interference that over-regulated the private sector and created an oligopolistic system where giant hospitals would dominate the market and many of the smaller hospitals would go under. It was thanks to you and your third-party payer system that monopolised cost in the background, that enabled the private pharmaceutical companies to get away with shafting the consumer through a collusion. It was thanks to you because of all the insurance that was introduced unnecessarily, because it's anti-capitalist, because it's anti-free market. And of course the Food and Drug Administration. That's why your American healthcare costs got out of control. And people like you try to blame that on capitalism, and then you say, I contradict myself. I think this is the last part of his comment. Right. you're under an impression that if we just let everything go with no government or extremely weak government, that everything would just fall into place magically. Nah, I never said that. In a capitalist system, you are not guaranteed success as a private company, but the system would work efficiently. And yes, it would work far better than your public sector. That's for goddamn sure. Because socialism doesn't work. As you said, ignoring history. I'm not the one ignoring history. I've given plenty of that in this video. And current realities. Oh, current realities. That's right. That's right. So, socialism creates a problem through the stripping of the gold standard, which is basically free market money. Socialism then creates the problem through running the printing press, all in the name of stimulating the economy. Yeah, how did that work out, devaluing the paper currency and resulting in inflation soaring out of control? Did that help the poor? And then, of course, there was the fixing of the interest rates, but that's right. We'll just, project the blame off onto capitalism because, that's exactly what your game is. And I could just go on and on and on. It's just so pathetic. You also seem to assume that there would be no natural disasters. Who said there wouldn't be natural disasters? There's natural disasters in all systems. That's part and parcel of the real world. You show me a system where there isn't that natural disasters. Are you honestly trying to tell me that through your mixed economy that you're solving the problem better through your misallocation of valuable scarce resources and the absence of profits and losses? Are you honestly trying to tell me that you're doing a better job of dealing with these crises, of dealing with things? The funny thing is, your socialism created a crisis in California when you stopped people grazing the land or whatever it was that caused, they ended up causing the bushfires and the forest fires. That was created by your socialist policies. I think is his name Jerry Brown or something? I can't remember his name. Him of California. He was the one that created the problem. Brown. He created it. He's the one that caused the forest fire and devastated it. Surprise, surprise. It's not the first time it's not the first time we've seen socialists doing something like that. We've seen it countless times. The record of socialism's failure on the environment is so stark it's unreal. We could even turn to that of, at least with a disaster like BP that caused a spill in the Gulf of Mexico, it actually paid for its damages. Now compare that to the state-owned oil company in Mexico that caused a massive spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Did the state pay for its damages? No. Why? Because the state doesn't. The state takes no accountability for its own actions. That's the price you pay for public ownership. At least the private sector bloody well paid for it. Got to laugh at that. And the funny thing was, BP was over-regulated. So there you go. As he says, or pandemics. Well, you're hardly doing a great job, today. In fact, the NHS, your wonderful utopian socialist nonsense, your wonderful NHS here in Britain, has set back cancer patients' lives. Those who might have a decade more to live probably only have a couple of years left to live because you've basically fast forwarded the problems. You've created the problems. I can't remember the full story. Tom Woods even goes into this information. There's a very good video on it. I don't pretend to be an expert, but the neglect that's been created, the problems that's been created through the lockdowns and everything, through government restrictions, and many people not even getting treatment. I think that's the very reason. And he explained that, and it's so sad. And he's going on about pandemics. If anything, the free market would get you your vaccinations quicker. And he says, that require larger responses. I've got to laugh at you, because see if you socialists ever created a lockdown at the same time as setting down price ceilings, you would lead to mass starvation, because the shop shelves would be empty and you would have locked them down. It would lead to a riot. It would lead to Venezuela. I shouldn't laugh at it because it's a very sad thing, but they were eating zoo animals. Bloody horrible. You know, these are endangered creatures, and there you go. But yeah, he wants to tell you about pandemics and his wonderful socialism and how that's a solution to the problem. You think problems are bad today? At least you had food in your shelves. At least you had food in your shelves. At least you had the likes of Amazon to deliver food to your door, and these, places who could deliver food to your door during the lockdowns. Because see if that came to a socialist economy, you would have none of that. In fact, if anything, you would end up like the Holodomor. As he says, if we lived in your system when the pandemic hit, everything would have went under, and we would have just returned to monkey with even more deaths. What are you talking about? The reason why businesses were going under was because of the lockdowns. That's a government restriction, you utter moron. That's the reason why they were being bailed out. Because your government set down the restrictions. They set down the lockdowns. If that was down to a free market, they wouldn't have set down the restrictions. They would have allowed people to go out and work. I've got to laugh at that. Then we have now, and that's assuming it wouldn't implode. Yeah, we've heard that nonsense before, yet Sweden contradicted you. I'm able to at least understand and admit that there are pointless and negatives to all systems, and how changes in policy impacts the bigger picture and minute details. You're completely ignoring everything and just spouting, and what you're blaming everything on socialism somehow. No, I blame socialism because it is the fault of socialism. I mean, what are you expecting? Of course it's the fault of socialism. To put it as nicely as I can, we simply have different worldviews. Yeah, you're right there, we do. The difference is, I understand what I'm talking about, you don't. I'd love a conversation with someone about policy and about different approaches, but you aren't doing that. You live in a fantasy. I live in the fantasy. I have given nothing but umpteen sources to back my evidence. I'm the one who gives the evidence. I'm the one who gives you the history that contradicts everything that you believe in. I'm the one that points out that the reason for why you've got the monopolies and oligopolies and cartels today is all because of your wonderful socialism. But I'm the one that lives in the fantasy. Despite the fact we saw the damage caused by all the government subsidies, despite the fact we saw all the damage that was caused through the fixing of the ratio or the fixing of the interest rates, I'm the problem. I'm the one who's deluded. I'm the one who lives in the fantasy. To be less nice, you're a libertarian. That's a compliment. That's not derogatory. That's a compliment. As you say, so what was I expecting? Well, I'm not surprised. Every time you come across a libertarian, they're too smart for you. That's what the problem is. You just don't listen to them. If you actually paid attention to what libertarians tell you, you would then understand where you're going wrong. As he says, libertarians literally require a utopia for their system to exist. No, they don't, because we saw in recorded history about the free market in the likes of Hong Kong and Singapore, etc. So that's utter nonsense. I feel like there are so many aspects of this that you simply don't understand. You aren't an idiot. You know a lot. I just think that the way that you apply that knowledge or interpret information is lacking some nuance. Okay, I'll retract my own statement because I think it's fair. At least you said that. At least you came out and said that. But your entire argument is still a load of nonsense. So anyway, folk, I've went through his entire argument. I think I've, covered enough on that as such. It's just it's so pathetic, folk. It's let me see if there's any interesting comments here that I might have left out. Hello.